Hello, good morning, and welcome. It's Thursday, November the 20th. Are the gender wars really over? Or might they be about to flare back up again at the worst possible time for Keir Starmer's grip on his party? My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. In April, the Supreme Court ruled on the legal definition of a woman, that it's based on biological sex, not gender identity, in a far-reaching judgment that appeared to provide clarity. But to work out what that meant in practice, the government Equalities and Human Rights Commission drew up a 300-page document spelling out specifics on toilets and changing rooms, sport and single-sex spaces. And 3 months ago, the EHRC handed this advice to government, to Bridget Phillipson and her department, and then silence.
And once it had got there, everybody waited. It looked a bit like it could be being sat on through the deputy leadership contest. But the advice has now turned up wholesale in The Times, which leads on the section of the guidance that says transgender people could be banned from single-sex spaces based on how they look, because it says there is no type of official record or document in the UK which provides reliable evidence of sex, because people can change their sex on passports and driving license without gender recognition certificates.
This is a political story, and what's more, it's the kind of political story that Keir Starmer hates, and is almost certainly something he's going to be asked on the flight to Johannesburg overnight tonight. So the government is going to be required to get clarity and get it out in public. Keir Starmer has said previously the Supreme Court ruling should be implemented, quote, in full and at all levels. But what does that mean in practice? Does it mean accepting the EHRC guidance in full? And some alarm bells are ringing for some. Just last week, the government was arguing in court that a transgender access to single-sex toilets should be decided on a case-by-case basis, which does appear to conflict with the Supreme Court ruling. Some Labour MPs, and this is the most important bit, don't like the proposal and have been writing to Peter Kyle saying that it's burdensome and complicated. So where does this leave Bridget Phillipson and Keir Starmer? Will they go ahead with the EHRC definition and advice and guidance, or will they listen to what looks like a backlash behind the scenes?
The other big news set to dominate today is the report by the COVID inquiry into how politicians fared in the pandemic. It's a public inquiry. It has cost in excess of £200 million to run it. A lot of trouble stored up there for politicians and officials running the country through 2020 and 2021, 800 pages long. We're going to get a televised statement by the chair, Baroness Hallet, and we are promised, according to Playbook, that there is going to be a lot of very, very wide-ranging detail there in terms of criticism and conclusions, not only about how politicians responded in the early days of the pandemic, which we've focused on a lot up to now, but about the rights and duties of Parliament, emergency powers, etc., and the impact of rule breaches, which takes us back to Partygate.
We know a fair bit of the areas the report is going to go into this afternoon. For instance, they're going to look at whether or not the four governments of the United Kingdom moved with sufficient urgency during the early stage of the pandemic. So I can give you a spoiler there, and they didn't. It'll look at whether restrictions on lockdowns were timely and reasonable. Spoiler alert, well, in some cases they clearly weren't. And whether any of the governments whether the government properly considered if lockdown would affect different people in different communities. Now, as we were saying yesterday, could this spell the end for Britain's now most senior Mandarin, Chris Wormold? He was, of course, running the health department during the pandemic where there wasn't a plan. I could spy the wagons circling last night, and your guys at Playbook were picking up similar. They were saying that they had confidence that, Wormold will get through. He'll be criticised, but the stuff that he'll be criticised for is already known. So that's all right then. It's a sort of very circular argument. We already knew what he had done, so there will not be a moment of reckoning. And they think that he will probably be fine. But let's see.
Let's see what we hear. As you say, I think there are two lots of briefings. One has been how hopeless, according to the briefers, Chris Wormold has been as the top civil servant. But he does have some support. And I think there are people like the Health Secretary Wes Streeting who've come to the view that wormwood is one of the grown-ups in the room, and that destabilising too much, Sam, even in the wake of criticism in this report would not really mend much that went wrong then, but would have a bad effect now. So let's see if that's another brick out of the wall, or whether Chris Wormald is still in post. I think there's also it can be quite a difficult day all round, I think, for Bridget Phillipson, partly because of the impact on children and schools. Obviously, she wasn't in post. It was Tory government at the time, but that sense that schools are still lagging to catch up on the adverse impacts of the lockdown.
The kind of big ticket item for the government today once again involves Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood. She's really been showing up the Prime Minister, I thought, for sort of pace and energy this week. He can seem a bit shy, I think, and that just leaves a vacuum for others with better media operations and a greater willingness to run into conflict to dominate the agenda. Normally, that's people from opposition parties, but now there's a hyperactive Home Secretary. She is sprinkling announcements and flooding the media. She is expected to head to the Commons mid-morning to announce that the amount of time that you have to stay in the UK before you can claim indefinite leave to remain will rise from 5 years to 10 years. Now, the idea is to prevent the kind of spike of new arrivals under the so-called Boris wave from getting a sort of path to permanent settlement and therefore potentially citizenship. So that'll be announced in the Commons mid-morning.
Interesting too will be where the exceptions would lie to this. The time frame could, for instance, be reduced if you're in a high-paying job, in a highly skilled industry, one that's deemed particularly to be nationally important, or by volunteering in the community, which is where things, I think, get a bit vaguer. So there's a Shabana Mahmood lobby that wants her to go further, faster, and be even louder, if that's possible, to see off reform and take that fight to reform. But there's also, I think, a desire for this not to end up as business unfriendly. It's a theme I'm sure we're going to come back to in the budget, and you've certainly mentioned a lot, Sam, in your own reporting and coverage, is how does the government can look as if it just wants to keep as many people out as possible, and where does that leave people that you might actually want in to aid this very urgent project of getting us back on a growth track. So I think this is where we will see concrete differences and dividing lines, even with the way that the policy was being scoped out and floated by Yvette Cooper when she was Home Secretary a few months back. Yvette Cooper might well be sitting alongside there thinking, well, Yvette Cooper can do things with her face that say, it's not as easy as it sounds, is it, when you first put out these top lines, Shabana?
The Guardian today leads on union claims that up to 50,000 nurses could quit the UK over the immigration plans. So that rather speaks to what you were just saying, Anne. Now, we want to go into something in a bit more detail today, and this is what Keir Starmer is going to be facing in the next 24, 36 hours over Ukraine. Now, yesterday we told you about a Russian-friendly peace initiative by President Trump to end the Ukraine war. Now, that seems to be gaining pace and is all over other media this morning. G20 leaders are going to have to confront this reality in Johannesburg. Now, Keir Starmer quite obviously has put so much political time and spent so much political capital trying to keep Donald Trump on the right side of the Ukraine war. So he will be desperate to avoid this deal being imposed, and President Zelenskyy, who is already under fire at home because of a corruption scandal, being basically sidelined and having something that he doesn't want imposed on him. And we're hearing that Ukraine is going to be asked as part of the Trump deal to A, make significant territorial concessions, and B, asked to cut the size of the armed forces, which is exactly what Russia wants. Where do you think we are?
So this is a plan put together by Steve Witkoff, the presidential envoy, and by Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund and the kind of finance guy, if you like, on the Kremlin team, who's increasingly close to Vladimir Putin and tends to take the limelight when it comes to pushing forward these possible ceasefire terms. Now, the problem with it is, for Ukraine, it is just a massive sacrifice of territory, the idea of having security guarantees, which are sketchily laid out, don't really work for Ukraine because they also say you've got to give up large chunks of your army, which obviously, if you're living next door to Russia, doesn't look like a good idea anytime in the future. And also, frankly, Sam, from the European point of view, it's unclear really whether this is just Vitkov, if you like, trying it on to see if Trump and Russia behind Europe's back can come to a deal, because there's nothing in here that is going to entice Europe or NATO to sit down at a table and try and bring Ukraine, even though the military situation is dire for Kyiv, to bring them to the table. So it's a bad deal. The question is it a bad deal that's really going to go anywhere, or will it kind of peter away if other forces are able to say to Donald Trump, this one is really not going to make you look good?
It's fascinating to hear how the characters, what one wouldn't call the criminology of what's going on, is so important here. There's another piece of criminology which seems quite important to me, but I want to know whether you think that this matters. And that's that apparently, according to the White House, Special Envoy to Ukraine Keith Kellogg will leave his post in January. Now, he matters because he was kind of a pro-Ukraine voice in the president's ear. Now, he's arguing that it's the natural end time for the job because he'd require further Senate approval. But he was seen as just a voice in the president's ear, advocating for Ukraine often during periods where Trump looked like he might be swinging the other way. Do you think that matters?
Yes, although I think General Kellogg, frankly, for a lot of this year has been benched. I spoke with him at the Munich Security Conference, that must have been last February. You're right, he was more Ukraine sympathetic, albeit pragmatic. He knew he was a general in the Trump administration. He wasn't putting out blue and yellow flags, but he was trying to come up with plans that wouldn't leave European security entirely in the lurch, or indeed Ukraine. But guess, Sam, who was very, very quick to repost that General Kellogg was leaving his post? One Kirill Dmitriev. 10 hours ago, I think, looking at my phone, he was obviously foregrounding the fact that someone you could see as a rival for Putin and for Trump's ear is out of the way. I tell you, it's one endless Kremlin succession series these days, but Ukraine bears the brunt of it.
Okay, so this is all stuff that Keir Starmer has got to navigate in Johannesburg. There are claims, not least from your colleague Esther Weber, that London wasn't really briefed on the US proposals, despite Jonathan Powell's close relationship with Steve Witkoff. So it sounds very challenging in South Africa tomorrow. Right, rather curiously, we've got through this episode without talking about Wednesday's budget. This is a little break for you, listeners. But I do have one thing for you. And this made my jaw drop. It's a bit of polling from you guys, Patrick English, that he outlined to me on a panel yesterday. And it's about the two-child benefit cap. Right. Everybody listening to this podcast will probably know that next week, Rachel Reeves is probably going to spend about £3 billion scrapping it. So YouGov asked some questions. The first thing they asked, for the public as a whole, is should you keep the cap or not? And keeping the cap is popular. Scrapping the cap is not. So asked if you think the two-child limit should be kept, 59% say it should, and barely half of that, 27%, say it shouldn't. But here's the thing, Anne, and this is the bit that really made my eyebrows raise. YouGov tried an experiment. Rather than asking the question in boring pollster language, they asked it in a much more emotive way. Yes, I can hear the alarm bells ringing. They gave an emotional appeal in the question. They said, do you think you should get rid of this cap, which means families do not receive any support to help feed and clothe and raise additional children, forcing many to go without? So what do you think, Anne, happened when we put the kind of the sort of sob story case for keeping the cap? Well, support for keeping the cap went up. Faced with the fears of children going without, more people thought that you should keep the two-child benefit cap in place, 61% as against 59%. Does that tell us something about the character of the British public?
But again, I would just say, what does it tell us? Like, it sounds eye-popping when you read it out. It probably, between the lines, I think it's saying people are saying, decide how many children you want to have and look after them well. So they may not be reacting in an entirely Dickensian way. maybe, and this is what's so interesting about polling, is that what are people really hearing and reacting to? And is it maybe something a little bit different to what the pollster or what the journalists like us are interpreting? Or did they then think about the question and say, yeah, that's precisely why this is why the cap was brought in, right? Why you should think more carefully. Now, the trouble is, does it really work that way in practice? And that you clearly have children who are entirely blameless, who are affected. But I think it's really interesting that you draw attention to how tweaking a question can tweak an answer, but not always as we expect.
What I think it also tells us is that Labour are spending a lot of money next week on plans that they hope will go down well with the Parliamentary Labour Party. Most of what I think this budget is going to end up with polls pretty strongly. This is not something that does, but they still feel they need to do because it's in line with Labour values. This is Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves spending money to lift the mood of the party, quite a lot of money, even though it's not quite where it would seem the bulk of the public are. But it's a big week next week, Anne. Do you want to just run through our plans?
We have a pretty busy week next week, what with that small event, the budget, looming. But starting from Monday, as well as our normal episode, Sam and I will be live from the CBI conference. That's at lunchtime. If you're there, do come and say hello. But we will also be recording there on the impacts of business on the budget, their hopes and fears. And lucky us, lucky you, we hope, there will be an extra special episode on Budget Day 2 in your feeds, and that will be at around 6:30 p.m, by which time we will have had time to go through what's happened in the budget, pick the brains of all our brilliant colleagues, and give you everything you need to know about a day which will help determine whether this government can survive and how it hits the rest of us.
Big week for the government, big week for us. Can't wait to see you till then. See you then.
See you then.
Hey, it's Sophie and Will from Sky News.
Too many headlines, too little time?
We get it, and that's why we're bringing you Cheat Sheet.
10 minutes every weekday morning.
All the big stories from politics to pop culture, minus the noise.
No doom scrolling, no spin, just the stories that matter from two people who live and breathe the news. Cheat Sheet with Ridge and Frost from Sky News.
Follow Cheat Sheet wherever you get your podcasts.